Sex is big business in America. And while some of the people in that business aren't there by choice, many consider themselves sex workers, willing participants in the nation's multi-billion-dollar sex trade. Across the country, it's a dangerous and illegal industry. Some workers think changing the laws around prostitution could make it safer. But what would that look like? I came to Nevada to see the only place in the US where sex for money is legal and out of the shadows. Deep in the desert, you'll find the only legal prostitution in America. There are 21 legal brothels in the US, all here in Nevada, and none are more recognizable than Dennis Hof's Moonlite Bunny Ranch. You're looking at the exception, the most elite, privileged form of commercial sex in this country. It takes some resources to even get this job. You have to be able to afford a license from the local sheriff and pass a thorough background check. I came here to hear the arguments in favor of legal and regulated sex work.
I'll take you to my room.
The women here are independent contractors and call themselves working girls. The house takes half of whatever they make during a transaction, what they'd call a party or a booking. Tiara Tay is 22 and was a dancer until she came here 2 months ago. While you were dancing, were you ever approached to do this illegally?
Yeah, I was propositioned every night.
And did you ever even consider it?
No, I never thought I'd be doing this. I was like, oh, I'll never do that. But then I heard like it's legal and where the girls are tested, like I gave it a chance. To be honest, I used to like talk down on it, like paying someone for sex, but now my whole mindset's changed and I'm a part of it. I got picked like my first time and I was like, I'm scared.
And then how did that happen? Like, how did that go down?
It was good. Like I just walked him through the house and then we came back in my room and we booked. It was good to get off my shoulders because like my first time standing in lineup, it is intimidating.
Was it what you thought it would be?
Yeah, you just stand there, say your name and see what he does.
No, but the first booking that you had.
It was really easy. It went really smooth and it was what I thought it was gonna be. As soon as I found out I was gonna be doing this, I kind of started going through goals in my head, like, what am I gonna do with this money? You know, I need to start a retirement fund. There's like a couple days where I'll go without booking.
And what's that like?
I mean, it sucks, but I try and stay positive.
How long do you see yourself doing this?
The next 8 years.
Yeah? Mm-hmm. 8 is such a specific number and you want to be here for 8 years. Mm-hmm. Do you have a number goal that you want to hit by that time?
Like money-wise, mm-hmm. I should have $500,000 by then, easily.
Yeah.
Easily. I should have $500,000 in the next few years. I'm not gonna lie, I'm expensive, and if they can afford it and if they're willing to do it, I will, break my boundaries to a certain extent. Some people look at it like, oh, she's a prostitute, she's a whore. Yeah, I am, but it's a job, and it's not gonna be forever. I'm getting money. That's great.
Yeah, hold on.
That's the bell.
What's the bell?
So that's a lineup. That'll be the time the customer will stand in front and then the girls will come out. We kind of have to hurry or else they're gonna start without us.
So there's a lineup happening, which means a customer just came through and the girls are going to line up and the customer is going to take their pick.
Hi, I'm Willow. Hello, I'm Sarah. Hey, I'm Lana. Hi, I'm Mercedes.
Hi, I'm Tiara.
So all of the girls are doing introductions. Everyone's dressed up and it's funny because their hands are behind their back and it seems like they're a little shy from where I'm looking, but they're introducing themselves to the client and he looks like he just picked a girl, the one straight in the middle, and he is walking her back down.
So I didn't get picked, but that's okay.
Yeah? Can you kind of explain to me how it feels every time, or is it just when it happens, it happens?
Yeah, it's just if he picks you, great. If not, then you wait for the next spell.
Hey, you guys, you gotta calm it down in there. Yeah. All right, we ready? We're gonna have some fun.
Dennis Hof is the owner and proprietor of the Moonlite Bunny Ranch and 6 other Nevada brothels. He's a businessman and a libertarian with political aspirations. And when it comes to laws around prostitution, he's one of the biggest advocates for legalization. Do you feel like you are empowering these women?
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. These are true businesswomen. We're empowering these girls. I mean, over half of our girls have college educations. 20-some% have master's degrees. I have 3 PhDs working for me. One of them is a professor at UNLV and a working girl for me. These girls are real businesswomen.
How many girls are applying to work for you a month?
1,000. If it's some girl that I think I'm really interested in, which would be typically a very attractive girl, a hot blonde, or a mixed girl that I think is unique, then I might get involved in it myself. We think we are a family. We're all a close-knit little community here that supports each other. The difference is we can have sexual interaction too, and the girls do it.
Can you define the word pimp in your own terms?
A pimp, in its simplest term, is a man that brings men or women to girls for sex. Okay. So in the simplest term, I'm a pimp, but I have a license. I have a business license to do this.
So you're a legal pimp.
I'm a legal pimp, absolutely. But in the street vernacular, in most people's thoughts, a pimp is a guy that goes to Kansas City, grabs underage girls, runaways, fills them up with drugs, and owns them and hauls them around to Oakland, Las Vegas, the sexual cesspool of America. So when you legalize something, who do you take out of the business? You take the underage girls out, because every girl here has to go down and get a business license, be fingerprinted, photographed. They run the federal check on them. Who else can't get in the business? The pimps. This business, the prostitution business worldwide, is a dirty, disgusting, drug-ridden, exploitive, disease-ridden business till you legalize it. And when you make it legal, everything changes. The whole game changes.
I think once you get past the photos of nudity everywhere, you realize that this is kind of just like any other business establishment. They don't even use, I guess, sexual terms in casual conversation about it. They refer to it as a business transaction because that's what they see it as. And just like any other business, there are safety regulations here. The women here go through thorough background checks and weekly STD tests, and someone could listen in at any time. There are security cameras and panic buttons, which is a lot different than the outside world of illegal prostitution.
Hi, I'm Willow. I've been here about 10 years.
And what's your title?
My title?
Yeah, like what do you
I'm
call
a prostitute. I'm a hooker.
If a young girl says that she wants to do this one day, what's typically your response?
No, have you thought it through? Like, because no, it's not for everybody. It's definitely not for everybody. Like, no, go to school first. You know, I'm not going to be like telling kids like, you know, come work here. No, ooh, gross.
Yeah?
Yeah, ooh, gross, no. Unless you're being a hooker on the street, this is a better option. Unless you're stripping, this might be a better option. If you go into the outside world, like we're going into their space, right? We're going into their house, into their hotel room, places that they've scoped out, right? That's their space.
A lot of the safety that you talk about is because you're in a brothel. So this is kind of the environment that it's already happening in. Do you think that it would be smart to legalize prostitution and let people do this independently outside of a brothel environment?
The thing is, what you're asking is something that's already happening. Like, you're asking me if it's safe, like, but it's happening regardless. So what's the harm in legalizing it? Like, it's only putting more safety measures in for the girls. You know, somebody's might be taking charge of their license plate. Some people can call the cops if they feel unsafe or insecure. Like, you know, you have that safety net. Yeah, I think legalizing it is, the best way to go.
There are a few different legal models for approaching the sex trade. Legalization is what we saw at the Bunny Ranch. It is the introduction of laws to control the sex trade, which means it's highly regulated. But there are other models across the world when it comes to prostitution. One is criminalization. Every part of the sex trade is illegal, and people are arrested and charged for it. It's the policy across the country, including where I'm from, in DC. the vast majority of the sex trade in the US happens outside of brothels and illegally. I wanted to find out how criminalizing prostitution affects people working in the sex trade. So I met up with Leah Monadas, a local artist and activist who engaged in what is known as survival sex during a period of homelessness.
So this area here in DC is like where probably a lot of the girls have worked. It's kind of transitioned from uptown a little to here, and then it goes all the way down for about probably a half mile, maybe a mile that way. The thing is, when you're a trans woman of color, what happens is that, like, particularly when you're doing sex work, a lot of the men don't respect you. They don't really think of you as a human being. They don't, you're just like an object to them. Even less so than like a cisgender woman. Oftentimes, they're not afraid to hurt you. And additionally, because you're a sex worker, they feel like, well, she can't even report this to the police. Right. So I can do whatever I want to you, right?
Did you feel like you couldn't report it to the police?
Absolutely. Because what am I going to tell what's my excuse for being in the strange man's car, right? Or what's my excuse for being in this man's apartment or house?
Yeah.
So it's terrifying, it's scary. You don't want to report these things to the police. So consequently, a lot of sex workers' lives are really fragile. It's really scary. And a lot of the girls out here do die or get injured, and oftentimes it doesn't get reported.
Were there experiences that you had while you were doing this for your own survival that you felt like your life was at enormous risk?
Yeah, so there were a few times where I was almost murdered.
You say that so casually. That's like such a... When
you've been through this, you are strong as a rock.
Yeah.
I have no fear anymore because I've been so close to death several times. I was in a car. This guy was speeding off. He didn't want to give me a donation. He ended up pulling a knife on me. And before I jumped out, he stabbed me twice. And then finally was able to open the door and I was able to get out. But I moved out of probably 40 mile per hour plus car. And I just rolled around. And I honestly, when I got up after rolling around, I was surprised I was still alive. And I was like, okay, adrenaline rushing. I'd just been stabbed. So then I ran and I took off, right? And amazingly, I thought he was done, but he turned the car around and then tried to chase me to run me over. So it was just, and then the worst part is I couldn't even report this to police. What am I gonna say? I was doing sex work and some man then tried to kill me.
What are some of the ways decriminalizing prostitution would make it safer for sex workers?
Well, for one, they could screen their clients a little better. They could talk to them a little more in the street and kind of assess, maybe even look around the car. They'll have a little extra time so they could see that knife. Maybe he's stashing by the door. They might see a gun that they didn't see before. They might be able to get their license plates down because they have more time. That way if something bad does happen, they can report it. Honestly, just being able to report stuff, if someone hurts you, you weren't afraid then to go to the cops. Yeah, I laugh about it because I have to create this barrier.
Of course, yeah.
But the truth is, it was completely terrifying. I don't wish that upon any human being ever. But, it happens, and it happens. Any one of these girls, if I can do anything to help a young trans person or other sex worker, cis woman, to not have that happen to them, I will do it. I don't care what the cost is, because I don't want that to ever happen to another human being again. I'm not a piece of trash. I'm a human being, and I don't deserve to be treated that way. I'm breaking down a little.
You're absolutely
People don't
right.
deserve that. Yeah.
No one does.
Stories like Leah's aren't that rare. We've heard similar stories of violence from sex workers who didn't want to talk to us on camera. But because the sex trade is an underground industry, national statistics are really hard to come by. Here's what we do know. At least 34 sex workers across the US were murdered in 2017. And a study of New York street sex workers found that up to 80% had experienced violence while working. Leah's experience is representative in another way. Nationally, trans women engage in sex work at a much higher rate than people who aren't trans. And in DC, 85% of trans sex workers are Black and Latino. Now, Leia's story is at the center of a push for change.
We're headed into a briefing at the DC Council talking about laws surrounding commercial sex. And in this area, there's a movement pushing for decriminalization.
Decriminalization is the removal of laws criminalizing the sex trade. Rather than regulating the sex trade, decriminalization just means people don't get charged for it. Removing criminal penalties is the logical first step for advocates like Leia, and it could eventually be a stepping stone on the way to legalization. This is a super early stage hearing, and Newsy had the only cameras in the room.
So good morning, everybody. I am Councilmember David Grosso. I'm an at-large council member here in the District of Columbia. The fact is that decriminalizing sex work, moving towards a approach that is more based in human rights is something that has been on my agenda now since Amnesty International came out a year ago with changing their approach.
It's not just Amnesty International. The World Health Organization and the UN's Program on AIDS have also supported removing criminal penalties for prostitution.
I want to make that clear that not all sex workers do sex work out of desperation, and some choose that profession. But I felt that, for me, I had no other choice.
We have a few minutes to take questions, and I'd love to facilitate some questions for the panel. So we'll start in the back, please. Go ahead.
Why would we decriminalize a profession that has such danger like that? And why go back to it as opposed to go through social services to get out of that, right? That's going to be a common question that people are going to ask.
So when you're doing something that's illegal, it becomes difficult to report it, right? So consequently, if you decriminalize sex work, if a man knows that he could potentially go to jail for assaulting me or pulling a knife on me, he's less likely to do it. But if he knows I'm not even probably going to report this, he knows he's more likely to get away with murder.
There's many reasons why there's violence. They don't inherently relate to sex work as a practice. It's more due to the criminalization than the work. So that's my broad answer.
There is widespread harm being done in the sex trade. There's exploitation, there's violence, there's discrimination, incarceration, disease, and of course, stigma. But we've realized in our reporting that people experience the sex trade on a spectrum. One of the working girls we talked to off camera at the Bunny Ranch used to work here in DC illegally, but she worked for a high-end escort service like this one. On one end of that sex trade spectrum, you have things like the Bunny Ranch and maybe even these high-end escort sites. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, you have terrible instances of trafficking and exploitation. But in between, there's a whole range of experiences, from some of the people on Backpage to some of the most marginalized members of our communities who are in the streets and selling sex in order to survive. And the thing is, these laws affect all of these people. So finding a solution, whatever that solution may be, is way more complicated than you think.
This policy to decriminalize commercial sex could be super controversial. I sat down with the council member who proposed the legislation to talk about people's concerns.
One of the pet peeves I have as a policymaker is that we keep trying the same thing over and over again and it doesn't work. For something like this, where you have two consenting adults that are exchanging some sort of money for sex, I don't see why that should have someone go to jail for that. But then also I think it's important that we remove the stigma from what this is about so that people can feel more comfortable asking for help if that's what they need.
Does this legislation encourage prostitution?
That's a trickier question. I don't think so, but we're not sure. And when you look at New Zealand, where they've already done this for over 10 years, we see that it doesn't.
Are you hopeful this will pass?
Hopeful is a good word. Yes, I always have hope, but I'm not confident that it will. I don't know if my colleagues are ready yet.
This is the first time Councilmember Grasso publicly introduces the legislation to decriminalize sex work, and it's a packed room, and people are pretty excited. You can tell that this is a really big deal.
Our goal should be to stop violence, not criminalize those who are working to survive. Sex workers are active members of the DC community too. And it's time we respect them with dignity, like we do the rest of the community. We're all human beings. Thank you.
Right now, we are headed into a few of the neighborhoods in DC where we've heard sex is being sold.
We've talked to a lot of people in the sex trade who say this is one of the areas police have pushed them to. This is how many buyers see the sex trade.
So the girl just went up to the car that was honking at her. You can only assume he's either a John or a pimp.
But what you could never know from this view is what led someone to the street corner. Maybe they're here by choice, but if it was force, fraud, or coercion, the federal government considers it trafficking. And if they're a minor, it is always trafficking. Thousands of people across the US are being trafficked for sex, many of them children.
What I really want to know, though, is how is this happening and what can we do about it?
When government agencies identify a child who has been trafficked for sex, there are a few things that have to happen. One of the first steps is often an interview with the victim in a room like this. On the other side of the glass, there are detectives, lawyers, child welfare, and case coordinators like Beth Bouchard.
How do kids end up in these situations?
When most people hear about human trafficking, they think that this is a problem that happens in other places, in other countries, and they have sort of that image of maybe a woman in chains, maybe somebody tied to a radiator. They might think sometimes the images in media will be portrayed as all white, so maybe the victims are all white females. And in reality, we see that kids, well, certainly some of our kids are held physically against their will. The majority of the kids that we see have sort of these invisible trauma bonds with their exploiter. And particularly for our commercial sexual exploitation cases, the dynamics of that abuse are very complicated, and they almost mirror domestic violence. I think we had a case a couple years ago with a youth who was recovered in a hotel in a sting with law enforcement, and she'd been exploited for multiple months. And she had talked about how her exploiter, she almost saw him as someone helping her and saving her, even though he was facilitating her sexual abuse every night. So you can see how, for especially a child, a youth in that situation, it can be very confusing.
Of the cases of exploitation that Beth and her colleagues work on, about 2/3 are kids of color, and more than 3 in 4 have a history of child abuse.
Can you describe to me the bridge of being a victim of abuse to becoming a person who is exploited?
We see that kids who have been sexually abused are targeted by perpetrators looking to exploit them. So that might mean that we have a youth who's been sexually abused and she encounters an exploiter who grooms her, and he might say something to her like, you were giving it away for free before, and you were having sex with people you didn't want to have sex with, but now I'm going to help you make money off of that.
But how would they know?
And they might not know. These youth have been traumatized before. All youth are looking for love and acceptance and a connection with somebody.
Young people who don't have a stable home life are vulnerable to trafficking. Homeless and runaway youth are especially at risk. And so are kids who are in the child welfare system or foster care. Ashley Sacho became a foster kid after her mother died when she was 9. She was trafficked while she was in government care.
What were the ages that this was happening to you?
About 11, 12, around that age. I know I stopped at 16.
Do you remember the first time you were introduced to, like, kind of explicitly to the concept of selling sex?
I remember it was the neighbor actually, and doing that I really don't like talk.
You don't
during
have to
that time it was difficult, and it was just like she would always be like, "Well, closed legs don't get fed, closed legs don't be fed." I never knew nothing about human trafficking. I never knew that I was being exploited. I didn't wake up and be like, "Oh, this is what's happening to me." It's something that I thought was normal. It was something that went on in my family. It was something that it was just like what it was. It's not until you realize like, oh, okay, other people don't live like this. And literally, it's not until you out of that box, because if you grew up in foster care and you grew up around certain things, this is not a nightmare. This is your life.
So can you tell me a little bit about your experience just kind of dealing with the government care system?
I think the government care system is broken, and I think that there's a lot of situations where it's like we as, you know, children that's in the foster care system, we don't know where we're supposed to be either. It's like literally you don't know what home, you don't know where you're supposed to be. You know, okay, I was here last, but then when I went back there, she told me she don't have me no more. So it's like, okay, do I go to the social worker and turn myself in? Because if you run away from your foster home or you run away from anything, you are considered a runaway youth, which you can get arrested for.
Right.
And my social worker switched so many times, so no one knew who case it belonged to.
Do you know how many times it switched?
Probably like 5 to 6 times, I don't know. Because every time I thought that a certain lady was my social worker, and they was like, no, this person your social worker, no, this person your social worker, no, this person, because it's just too many cases.
Do you feel like kids in the system are easier targets for people who are trying to exploit them?
Yeah. I think any kid is an easy target that don't know how to love themselves or wasn't provided with love and care.
The entire point of foster care is that it's supposed to take care of children who need help. But right now, the system is failing a lot of kids. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 88% of their cases of likely child sex trafficking involved a child who was in the care of social services when they went missing. And other professions that are supposed to help are also failing victims of trafficking.
Come in.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Letitia, student doctor, first year. Here's your picture. How are you? Okay. So just burning and itching. Have you had sex?
Across the country, scenes like this play out all of the time. Up to 88% of trafficking victims saw a medical professional while they were being exploited. But doctors are missing the signs.
So, anything else you want to talk about, or? What?
She's stuck.
For the record, this is not a real patient. This is an actor playing a victim of human trafficking. It's part of a training for medical students at the University of Louisville. Dr. Olivia Middles started these trainings after an experience where she believes she missed the signs of sex trafficking.
I discharged her home, but it was mostly because she was that distant type patient that didn't really want to communicate with me, didn't want to ask questions, didn't want me to really talk to her at all. And so I thought of her more as just a bad kid, and for lack of a better word. You know, I just thought that she wasn't going to listen to me. I don't know what she's been through. I don't know the type of life that she has, and so for that reason, she's not going to listen to me. And so that was my take on it, wrongly so.
Trainings like Dr. Middles are happening across the country. They're being led by doctors who believe in combating human trafficking from a public health perspective. Dr. Hani Stiklosa is the executive director of a network of healthcare providers who are focused on combating trafficking.
What we're saying is we need to change societal norms so that we're preventing trafficking. We're saying that we need to strengthen families so that children from broken homes don't end up being exploited by traffickers. When we're training healthcare providers about trafficking, it's not just about, hey, trafficking's happening, hey, these are the vulnerable populations, but it's about opening their hearts and minds to question their own unconscious biases with patients. But then there are definitely particular populations where I know that they're more likely to be trafficked, and I will take a closer look and ask more questions for those patients. So, for example, for patients that are using substances like heroin, like meth, these are patients that are at super risk for being trafficked. We see that traffickers will actually go to methadone or Suboxone clinics and recruit directly from detox centers.
Addiction to heroin and other drugs often comes into play for victims of sex trafficking. In Boston, an organization called My Life, My Choice provides mentors like Ann Wilkinson to help exploited youth transition from victim to survivor.
Drugs played a major part in my exploitation, as I think it does with girls. I had to use drugs to medicate and sedate myself for what was going on. I have never, the entire time that I was I was high. I was never not high when I was when I had to turn a date. I see a lot more youth being exploited, and I see them sort of thinking or kind of perceiving it as exploiting themselves, but having to work to feed their addiction. You know what I mean? To supply drugs for themselves or even for their pimp.
What are some of the situations that you've seen?
I've seen girls, I have one girl in particular who is still struggling with heroin addiction, and she was introduced to heroin by her pimp. And he would, shoot her up and keep her kind of in a daze so that she could work. And now she has a full-blown heroin addiction and is struggling to get clean. I think that a lot of girls, the substance abuse goes hand in hand because of the trauma that you experience. I've had a gun to my head. I've been beaten by John or robbed or all of that. And so that's what you encounter. It's not just your pimp. You don't know what you're going to get on the other side of that door when you go in that room. I got clean at 30. I'm an adult. And so it was a little bit different for me because I was a little more mature. And so I have to always remember that these are children. So if you're 15 years old and you've got a heroin addiction, that's heavy.
I wanted to find out if this overlap between opioids and trafficking is happening in other places struggling with the heroin crisis. So I went somewhere that's been hit especially hard, Covington, Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati. Overdose deaths are now the #1 killer of Americans under the age of 50, and it's only gotten worse in recent years.
We got a chance of an overdose.
So we are headed to a scene of an overdose. There's been several today, and it's past 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, so these are happening in broad daylight. So they just told us that there were 5 overdoses in 25 minutes just in this area, in this part of town.
But it's hard to actually find numbers on how the opioid crisis is intersecting with human trafficking. We called officials in the top 15 states for overdoses in the country. We were looking for reports on human trafficking that also looked at whether or not drugs were involved. What we found was an inconsistent patchwork of reports on the subject, but most of the states did acknowledge a connection. Kentucky is one of the states that actually does keep track of this, and we got a look at its numbers. So in 2016, reports show 1/3 of child human trafficking cases involved drugs in some way.
And we wanted to find out more of how this was happening, so we filed a records request with Kentucky's Cabinet for Health and Human Services. Of the 80 alleged victims in which drugs were provided or involved in the trafficking, the age range was between 2 and 17 years old. We spoke to sources in Kentucky who said that in the especially young cases of trafficking, parents who have a drug habit are feeding that habit by selling time with their kids to pedophile drug dealers, basically.
She traded her 11-year-old daughter to her drug dealer for sex.
Rape, human trafficking, corruption of a minor, 10 guilty pleas in all. Prosecutors say heroin addiction was the driving force.
I mean, I know there's a heroin epidemic and that being addicted to such a strong drug really is a disease because it makes you do things that are usually unfathomable to you. But to get to the point of desperation where you see dollar signs on your kid's forehead is something that I can't really wrap my mind around.
And if other states aren't even keeping records like this, they might have a big problem they don't even know about.
So we're up bright and early, and we're on our way to a human trafficking training that the Attorney General of Kentucky will be at. He's been doing a lot of work on this issue, and we're hoping we get to talk to him. I think a lot of the people here are actually undercover officers, so we can't show their faces.
Attorney generals are their state's chief law enforcement officer, so they have a big role to play when it comes to sex trafficking, including leading trainings like this one, which was partly funded by a grant from the Department of Justice.
Good morning. We look forward to this training on the next 3 days, but what we really look forward to is watching and helping with the work you're going to do in your communities moving forward. There's a lot of people out there who need our help. Thank God you're here to provide them that. Thank you all very much.
Hi, Mr. Bashir.
Andy
Good to meet
Bashir.
you. I'm Noor. Are trafficking and drugs connected?
Absolutely. Sadly, right now, just about every crime and drugs are connected. And Kentucky has one of the worst drug epidemics in the country. We were the birthplace of the pill mills that pushed out opioids by the hundreds of thousands and millions. There was a time in Kentucky where there were more than 10 prescriptions for every person. The connection in Kentucky is absolutely real, and we see tragic situations. We see mothers who get their daughters addicted to heroin so that they can traffic them. We've seen a number of those cases. We see foster parents using drugs as a way to create dependence. So definitely one part of addressing human trafficking is addressing that drug epidemic.
Attorney General Bashir told me about a local survivor and activist who runs a safe house for people trying to get out of the life of sex trafficking.
How are you?
Just wonderful. Well, of course, this is a safe place for victims of human trafficking. We show a lot of compassion, a lot of love, and of course, I am a survivor, so that make it extra.
Are all the girls who come through here out of the life, or some of them still in transition?
All of them. Most of the girls come straight off the streets. Even if she gets free, we still have to deal with that chemical dependency, because she could be free, but if she's still suffering from addiction, all it's going to do is push her back to the street. Just come here is a major accomplishment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because we real define it. When we get free, we think everybody's just trying to attack us or hurt us in some kind of form. That, like, they really don't care. So I think, yeah, they really don't care about us. It's like, it's so real. Everybody just think this we just run around, just want our bodies to be sold. But they don't know the underground world. When everybody be asleep at night, what we go through from like 12 to midnight to 6 in the morning. That's when the real stuff be happening. You know, everybody be asleep. It's like The Walking Dead out there. It's like The Walking Dead.
What are things people should be looking for?
I think people need to be looking for, one of my biggest things that I had a problem with, when people went to work, they see me on that corner when they went to work, they see me on that corner when they got off of work, and they see me on that same corner for 3 or 4 days. Something is wrong. And nobody's never stopped and asked. So that it's very important that our lives matters too. And we're not bad people. We just got in a bad situation.
There's one factor in the sex trade that's usually ignored: the buyers. Their money fuels the demand for sex. Across the country, when men get caught trying to buy sex, they might have to pay a fine or maybe watch a video. But in Seattle, they're taking a totally different approach. We're about to walk into one of the most intense classes in the entire country for sex buyers, and we're not entirely sure if they're gonna let us sit in on it. For obvious reasons, the men might not be comfortable with that, but we're gonna at least try. I have no idea how these guys are going to react to me, but I'm really hoping I'll be able to convince at least one of them to talk.
Let me just check in and make sure that he's finished up with the exercise. Let me bring her in and introduce. Hey, Noor.
Yeah?
Come on in.
Most of the men in this class are here because they were arrested. That means I have a pretty rare opportunity, a room full of captive sex buyers. It's my best chance to talk to one of them.
Your participation is not a requirement of this class. I will still love you if you choose to not attend.
I feel like I should do something because it is kind of a community service thing. I think I have some stuff to make up for. So
I appreciate that.
All but one left, and the one that stayed wanted to be anonymous. That's how it goes for these guys. When they're caught, they aren't shamed as a prostitute, a victim, or damaged. They get to go by John, the most anonymous factor in the commercial sex equation.
So part of, to be able to make it disappear from my record is to take this class. And it's a problem that I've had for quite some time, and it's good to be doing something about it as opposed to just keep on keeping on. I mean, I don't know, it's kind of somewhat normalized, it's the oldest profession, all that stuff. But I don't know, it's just, I was in a really lonely place. I was in a really bad relationship, and I just, it's kind of a way of gratification, just a way of tuning out, I guess.
Do you remember the first time you solicited someone for sex?
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
I did it through online, and I ended up, it was kind of almost like it was available. It was like, oh, it's like shopping online for people to have sex with. The girls advertised, and there were reviews.
Did you feel like she was okay with it, or she was consenting, or this was okay?
You're responding to an ad, so the expectation is they're okay with that. The girls, like the board that I was on, there was actually a menu where it was like, this is what the girls will do. I was aware to a certain level that there were pimps. It's something that's easy when you're the John or whatever not to think about, because you're not thinking about them, you're thinking about yourself, obviously. There's a reason why they call it a trick. It's because they're a trick, it's a fantasy, and it's just it's very selfish. This is a selfish act.
Had you ever told anyone about it?
Nope.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, would you?
So what were you expecting out of the class?
I don't know. I was a little fearful about just being shamed the whole time, but it's definitely more than that. You know, it's pretty well thought out. I think they do a pretty good job of, you know, initially just breaking down, you know, this is why it's wrong. These are the societal things that have happened that maybe sexualize women and make men treat them as objects, you know, and like it's kind of okay in our society to a certain extent, and like how wrong that is, and then, you know, how to cope with that and move on.
Can I ask about your just kind of, I guess, mentality towards women while you were buying sex? Like, did you have any, I don't know, specific thoughts about women?
I was mad at my wife. For me, it's kind of as simple as that, and I know it's like a horrible like coping mechanism to see prostitutes because you're mad at your wife, but that's why I did it.
Yeah.
That's why I did it. It was, you know, and then it became a compulsive behavior for me. It's something I did a lot. I was just used to it. It was like an escape.
Are you still with her?
Yes.
How did you guys deal with all of this?
We're dealing with it right now, like couples counseling and this, and then a lot of talking. And who knows, you know, it's hard to say how it's going to turn out. I'm hoping that we can stay together, but it's a lot to ask.
So next week will be our last week. Those of you who have been mandated here by the courts, we're going to be notifying the courts directly.
The 10-week class tries to teach men to have healthy relationships and sex lives. It's led by Peter Qualiteen, who works with survivors of prostitution during the day. On one day of the class, we saw him read a poem written by a survivor.
And it's called While I Was Pleasuring You. While I was pleasuring you, I learned not to sleep. Wide awake, overwhelmed by my thoughts, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to fill the room you tore open inside me. My father was abusive, and I recognized pretty early on that although his abuse became a problem for my mom and my siblings and myself, that it started with him. It, in fact, was his problem. And as I got older, I saw that, you know, men's violence was happening in a lot of houses, and that it wasn't just about domestic violence, but sexual assault and sexual harassment. And I think for me, in my 20s, when I was doing rape prevention and sexual violence or domestic violence prevention, I wasn't really considering prostitution, and it was the fact that I had such a big blind spot around it that I didn't see the harm.
Why is it so important to focus on the buyers?
Unless we take away the profit motive for exploitation, there's going to be generation after generation of folks who are turned out to meet the demand. It's not just about combating trafficking, that there's no trafficking without prostitution. There's no prostitution without demand and men's entitlement to the bodies of women and children and others. And so really, fundamentally, I think learning to see the act of buying sex in and of itself as an act of exploitation. It's not just wrong because it causes trafficking, it's just wrong. It's non-consensual sex.
Nationwide, there's an effort to go after the buyers to end the demand for commercial sex. It often looks like this: buyer stings.
Hands up! Put your hands up!
But Seattle is pushing for a broader culture shift, and that goes all the way up to the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office.
Hi, Val. Noor, good to meet you.
The city has made some big changes recently when it comes to commercial sex.
White people are 70% of the population here, but only 37% of the victims. African American people are 7% of the population, but 52% of the victims who ends up in prostitution.
Yeah.
It's marginalized people. So what does that tell you about what prostitution is all about? It's a crime of power and privilege and entitlement.
Seattle is working towards something known as the Nordic model. Selling sex is decriminalized, but the rest of the sex trade is still criminalized. Some people hold the Nordic model up as a solution to human trafficking. They say you have to end the demand to end the exploitation.
We were vastly disproportionately arresting women and children in prostitution versus buyers. We were prosecuting them at a rate of 3 or 4 to 1. We were arresting them at a rate of maybe 25 to 1. So we went from a peak a few years ago of 446 charges of prostitution in our county. Last year we had 37. So these are really, positive steps towards getting victims out of the criminal justice system like I talked about. However, buyers can be deterred if you demonstrate to them that there is a real risk that they're going to get caught and that this as a practice is totally unacceptable in our community.
There's another way people across the country are trying to cut off the demand for commercial sex by targeting sites like Backpage. It's a site where people can post classified ads, kind of like Craigslist, but it's become the go-to place to buy sex in the US.
I don't know, Seattle, Backpage, new in town, smoking hot, 18. 19-year-old, new in town, 100% real. Please do not ask for any face pictures for my own privacy and safety. This is so crazy, man. She's 18. So, right now in Seattle, in King County, thousands of men are doing this every single day. I mean, if you were to look at any of these ads, you'd never be able to tell whether they're being trafficked. We wanted to get an idea of the scale of the online sex market in the US. So we set up a web scraping program to try to track the number of personal ads posted across the entire country on Backpage. We learned that in a week in January, at least 54,000 ads were posted in the US in the dating sections of this site. And Backpage makes money from each and every one of those ads. There's a lot of sex being advertised on Backpage, but some of what's on there is trafficking. Between 2006 and 2017, Backpage was involved in 74% of all reports received of online child sex trafficking to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
My daughter, Desiree Robinson, was born March 29, 2000 at 2:52 p.m. She was only 16 years old and just wanted to make friends. We now know that adult men found Desiree on social media, reached out to her, pressured her, and used her to make money. On December 23rd, 2016, a 32-year-old man by the name of Antonio Rosales was looking through Backpage.com for a child to have a sex with. During his search, he came upon the picture of my 16-year-old daughter under the posting, "New girl in town looking to have fun," which was posted by her pimp. This was the last night of my daughter's life. And her pictures were posted and moderated by Backpage.com. The truth is, Backpage.com and other sites are making millions of dollars by exploiting our children.
Desiree's mom was asking the Senate to change the Communications Decency Act. Right now, it shields websites from being held accountable for harmful things that were posted by third parties. But there's a bill to change that. It was co-sponsored by Senator Rob Portman, a Republican from Ohio, who founded the Senate caucus to end human trafficking.
This is really unbelievable that in the 21st century, in this country, we are seeing not just trafficking, but increasing trafficking. Sex trafficking online, I believe, is the primary reason for that. I also believe that the drug epidemic has contributed to it. And I just think Congress has a huge role to play here.
Why did you choose to take a specific approach on Backpage?
About 3/4, maybe even 80% of the commercial sex trafficking goes on one site, one single site. We were able to show that this organization not only sells girls, boys, women online, but they actually know they're doing it because they were taking ads that were clearly about underage girls and actually editing them to make it appear as though they were not underage. So this was as bad as you can imagine.
In terms of Backpage, we've also been talking to women who engage in selling sex as a means of survival. Do you think it's important to include them in the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. And, you know, this is an issue that goes well beyond the discussion about online sex trafficking, because the issue of prostitution and the issue of, you know, how you address, as you said earlier, the most vulnerable populations has to be part of this discussion. Backpage, you know, having spent a lot of time now studying this and getting to know their practices and how they operate, they're not looking out for your best interests.
We reached out to Backpage, but didn't get a response. Going after the sites where sex is bought and going after buyers are both efforts to cut off the demand in order to end the supply. But not everyone agrees that these anti-demand approaches are the best way to end harm in the sex trade. I wanted to really understand why some experts are critical of the approach I saw in Seattle. So I met up with the executive director of a national anti-trafficking organization.
When law enforcement is working to arrest buyers, buyers are aware of that, right? And then are less likely to take time to answer questions from sex workers, right? You know, what we've heard from people engaged in consensual commercial sex work and in different sexual economies is that the more they're able to take the time to engage with potential customers, the safer they are.
There's a saying that violence against women is not a women's issue, it's actually a men's issue. And in Seattle, we saw this in the buyers' classes, where men were being held responsible for their role in a harmful system. Shouldn't we want people who are a part of the problem to do better, to know better, and to kind of understand their role in such a harmful system?
So I think that, I mean, what we keep running into though is that the way this is being implemented, like I agree, teaching men about toxic masculinity is a great thing to do. However, when the only way to get to that education is through an arrest which makes the workers less safe in that industry, then I don't think actually you've found the solution.
How do you think we should tackle the harm that's going on in the sex trade?
You know, what we hear often is that people who feel trapped in the sex trade are people who are at the margins of our society. We have a weak social safety net. We have no affordable housing left. What we hear often is that people feel like sex work is the best paid job they can find, or that it is their only option.
I mean, what does that say about our society then?
It says very scary things about our society. When anyone feels they have only one option, there is only one way, and it is a very dangerous occupation, in order to feed themselves and their families, we are failing that community.
Marginalized communities are especially at risk of ending up in the sex trade. I wanted to talk to a local activist about this, so I went to an event for World AIDS Day that Charisse Monet helped set up. Monet has done sex work in DC and thinks taking down Backpage would put a lot of people like her in harm's way.
I'm a trans woman of color, and I'm here today to show that we need resources, that we need help, that we need diversion, we need diversity programs to help us, educate us, train us, teach us. A lot of times this word sex work it scares people, but I don't want you to be afraid of it. I want you to be aware of it so you can understand why we're doing it. Not because it's fun or it's something to do. We're doing it to survive because there is no other way. And it's a lot of people that are pushing for a lot of things, but before they push for these things, they need to make sure that there's a cushion for the trans community to fall on. You can't take Backpage or Craigslist or something like that away. For the trans community, for a lot of communities, it will take work away. It will take survival away, meaning you will do nothing but push them to the streets. Ask them, why are they sex working? That's the issue. 9 times out of 10 it'll be housing. Like the issues keep going on and on. It could be a mental stability. It can be a lot of issues, but if we can't fix the issues, how can you take away something without having something in its place to fix it?
But when it comes to sex work and the marketplace of sex work, where there are people who are doing this for survival and because they want to, and then there are people who are being exploited,
Yes.
How do we balance that conversation?
By having it, by talking. This is one of the steps.